You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, and welcome to News Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we get behind the headlines to discuss the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Miranda Prynne, and joining me today is Times Higher Education Editor-in-Chief, Chris Havergal. Chris, great to have you back. You're becoming something of a regular on News Talks these days.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Miranda. Always a pleasure.
Well, it's good to have you here because we are going to draw on your extensive knowledge of higher education in the UK and further afield to explore the question of whether university mergers are a sensible way forward for a sector in financial turmoil. And this is off the back of the recent announcement that King's College London and Cranfield University are planning to merge by August 2027. This comes 8 months after the universities of Kent and Greenwich announced they'd be joining forces to form a new university group. And we've also seen a major merger in Australia this year as the new Adelaide University, which brings together the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia, launched in January. This week, we've also had the news that 2 in 5 universities say they are open to or considering mergers or acquisitions with other universities. And that's based on a Universities UK survey of more than 140 institutions this year. But coming back to the current news of King's and Cranfield, these are 2 very different institutions. On size alone, King's is one of the largest universities in the UK. It's got more than 40,000 students spread across 5 campuses, whereas Cranfield, as a specialist postgrad institution, welcomes about 5,000 students a year and is known for its strengths in engineering. So what are we being told by King's and Cranfield about the reasons for this merger, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, they see this, they describe it not as being a defensive move. They say it's a positive and ambitious move. They say it's a merger. In essence, it is essentially a takeover. And they've been opened. Cranfield will become part of King's by next summer, August 2027. I suppose its strength lies sort of as you've described it. It brings together a specialist institution with real strengths in engineering and defence, with one of the sort of great comprehensive universities of the UK. Creates a more powerful university at the heart of the golden triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge. A bigger player on the HE scene that should be better placed to drive forward research and contribute to national skill needs. That's their case, at least.
Okay, and what do we think really lies behind it?
You detected a slight note of scepticism there from me, perhaps, because what you are essentially seeing here is King's acquiring Cranfield's expertise in engineering, an area where King's has traditionally been much weaker, but complementing some of its existing strengths in areas like policy and security studies. You also get a top-class management school in the bargain as well when you take on Cranfield. And you would hope, if you're at King's, for an improvement in rankings, research excellence framework scores, and more efficiency from being able to work on this scale. I think also for King's, it gets them a seat at the top table on things like defence and advanced technologies, when that is a increasingly important area of focus for the government. And from a pure sort of physical perspective, King's, as you said, campuses bang in the middle of London, is extremely constrained in terms of future development. Cranfield, on a former airfield in Bedfordshire, has room to expand. So that's sort of what's in it for King's, I suppose. The other side of it is Cranfield's current situation. We've talked about a sector financial crisis. Cranfield was probably particularly exposed to this. Small institution, but with significant research costs. It's just posted a multi-million-pound deficit, was probably heading for another one, forecasting a 20% drop in student numbers this year, which is pretty significant. Had lots of financial indicators going in the wrong direction. It would have been hit by the collapse in international masters recruitment as a postgraduate-only institution. And again, the block on level 7 apprenticeship funding would be another blow for an institution like this. So, essentially you have here a distressed institution and a Russell Group university which is weakest in the area where the smallest provider is strongest. In that sense, it's a good match. Whether that means it's a good model for the rest of the sector to follow is a different question.
Of course. And I know our THE reporter, Juliet Rousel, spoke to staff at both universities who offered a somewhat mixed reaction. I think it'd be fair to say that staff at Cranfield were perhaps more optimistic about the outcome. Staff at King's maybe a little more apprehensive. Are the feelings of the staff well-founded, do you think?
I mean, I think the overriding feeling of staff in the first instance was of surprise or even shock. I think staff found out about this a couple of hours before the media announcement, and possibly in the case of some staff at Cranfield, they found out from the media first when there was a breach of the embargo by some local journalists. So surprise, yes. I mean, that's not unusual because one of the first things you do in these negotiations, you sign a confidentiality agreement straight away. That's pretty standard. But beyond that, as you say, I think, yeah, mixed feelings. Probably a recognition at Cranfield that it provides greater security for an institution which was on a difficult trajectory, and a sense as well that these are institutions that has probably relatively limited overlap between their existing offerings, which means they're a good fit and might be seen to limit the number of redundancies, certainly, for example, on the academic side that you might see coming out of this. But still, I think there'll be a fear on both sides about job losses and what it means. And there's perhaps an interesting thing as well at King's, which, again, a big Russell Group university, large staff base, traditionally very active unions, and indeed a concern among some of those staff about military research. Indeed, some of the staff at King's have said there should be sort of a conscientious objection clause for staff just not to be involved in any of that. Cranfield clearly does have a very strong focus on advanced technologies, dual-use technologies, things with a military application. And so, that could emerge as a potential difficulty. But I think, along with mixed feelings, I imagine there's also just an awful lot of wait and see. In some ways, the easy bit of coming together like this is announcing the merger. Is actually then much harder to integrate two institutions in terms of bringing together functions, structures, and policies, and indeed, making the efficiencies which you would expect come with an agreement like this. So, yeah, lots more still to come, I'm sure.
Yes, although, as you say, in a way, the lack of overlap probably does provide some comfort, because clearly the biggest fear that one would probably expect among staff when a merger is announced is inevitably job losses at a time when that is hitting the sector pretty hard anyway. But, perhaps let's consider some of the mergers that have already happened in the UK and Australia, as they might offer some useful lessons. Starting with the UK, City University of London and St George's University of London merged in 2024 in a move that's been generally considered a success. Why do you think that is? What characteristics have made that work?
I mean, in some ways, it's quite similar to the King's and Cranfield deal in that you've got here a specialist institution joining a comprehensive provider and filling a gap in its offering. So here you've got City, a big university with real expertise in health sciences and healthcare, essentially acquiring a medical school. And that's a medical school in St George's that had been looking for a merger for many years. So this didn't come out of nowhere. From City's perspective, I think it gives them real scale, and it makes sense with their mission, which is very much focused on professional education. It's a sensible mission at a time when there are increasing doubts about the value of traditional, purely academic focused higher education. I think they probably also went about it in quite a sensible way. And one example is when they brought the medical school from St George's together with the health sciences bit of City, they recruited an outsider to lead that school. So it doesn't just feel completely like one institution is just walking in and taking over the institution. But there's still, as I said, a lot of integration to happen. Again, this is something that's happened for a couple of years now, but they've actually put off still a lot of the very hard integration and some of the job losses that inevitably might come with this. So although I think they've got this far successfully, it may still be that perceptions of that partnership change as they finally get down to bringing them properly together.
Yeah, and that's telling in itself, isn't it? That 2 years down the line, this is still in progress and not a project that could be said to be, in inverted commas, completed. Moving to Australia, and the new Adelaide University, which had a fairly well documented rocky first few weeks. Why was this? And have things generally settled? And what perhaps does it tell us about some of the challenges of these mergers?
A lot of what we saw at Adelaide was sort of teething problems. And I think they're sort of inevitable when you bring together what in this case was already two quite decent sized universities. This was a real coming together. And, things like access cards not working and things like that perhaps isn't surprising, although very annoying. I think also what you see there is a different scale of ambition rather than simply a big institution acquiring a smaller one. You've got two coming together and it's being accompanied at the same time by a new curriculum, new academic calendar, new pedagogical approaches at the same time. So the ambition is impressive, but they've made life harder for themselves by doing all this activity at the same time. I just think this reflects that universities are complex organisations shaped by policies, traditions, and structures that have developed organically over very long periods of time. Bringing them together is always going to be challenging. I mean, I think you've got a new leader in Adelaide now, Nicola Phillips, herself formerly of King's. And, by all accounts, she's spending her time sort of, listening to people, getting to know the institution and seeking to address those challenges. But I think it just underlines that it's never going to be straightforward when it actually comes to sort of that day one where you say, this is the day we're one institution.
Yes, and in many ways, the new Adelaide University represents a merger in the much more pure sense of the word, as you say. Unlike something that could almost be labelled more of an acquisition, this really was two big institutions becoming one university with a new name accorded to it. And this is relatively rare. It certainly differs greatly in approach to the next merger we will look at, which is the universities of Kent and Greenwich, which state that they will be maintaining their identities. What do we know about how that project is progressing so far?
Well, they've signed the agreement now to become a single legal entity by the 1st of August. And I think there were many people in the sector who still were really questioning whether this deal would actually happen. It does look like it's going ahead. They've appointed a new leadership team, and I think the Board of Governors is coming together too. You're right that this is a different structure, that it's more of a federal model where the two institutions are going to continue to recruit, teach, and graduate students under their individual identities. So what it looks like in practice remains to be seen. And again, this is another example. This is a constant thing that actually you bring the institutions together, but then all of the integration and structural changes are further down the road. So a lot still to be seen. But I mean, again, just a final point on this. We talk about it as a merger. It is still essentially a takeover. Kent was a very troubled university that had run out of road. Greenwich happens to have the resources, or at least thinks it's got the resources. They've got some geographical proximity and a history of working together. But it's a different model, and one I think which will be watched very closely because, as we've said, proper full-blown mergers that we can see are difficult to achieve.
Yes. And are there any other countries where university mergers have become more common in recent years? Obviously, we've focused on the UK and Australia, but is this happening elsewhere?
Well, I mean, let's stay with Australia for a moment. It's actually interesting on the back of the Adelaide merger. What we see now in Western Australia is a suggestion you might see a similar thing happening there, where you could see the University of Western Australia uniting with either Murdoch University or Curtin University or both of them. And what's perhaps interesting in the Australian case is that these mergers are often very much driven by politicians who want to see institutions that have got sufficient scale to compete nationally. I suppose in the case of both Adelaide and Perth, you're sort of thinking of the second tier Australian cities that always lose out to Sydney, Melbourne and the like, but also to compete internationally, to attract more investment and drive economic growth. So that's quite an interesting model, recognising that universities do need a certain scale to run efficiently and compete on the international stage. And there are other examples of that. I suppose take two very diverse examples. India would be one, where there's a country where you still have universities dedicated to particular sectors and even professions, a police university, for example. And the Indian National Education Policy has a goal that you would bring these institutions together in large multidisciplinary providers spread across regions of India, again with that goal of scale, meeting student choice and being competitive. France is another example which over the last 10, 15 years has had something called the IDEX initiative, which, again, France had a smorgasbord of diverse and small historic institutions and has tried to bring them together into more comprehensive providers that can compete on the international stage, the likes of Sorbonne University and Paris-Saclay, which are now up and running, although, again, hasn't been without its teething problems by any means. But I suppose that those are the examples of the politically driven and the sort of more strategically driven mergers. One of the reasons we're perhaps seeing so much activity at the moment is that mergers often reflect concerns that countries simply have too many universities, either for the funding that's available or the number of students that are there to go around, and the two are often closely linked. So we see growing merger activity in places like Japan and South Korea, which have aging populations, real sort of demographic challenges, and limited government funding. And in some cases, that's creating institutions which are, have the potential to rank highly and really have international respect, like the Institute of Science Tokyo, which was formed from a medical and a technological university. But look, we see it in other developed sectors as well, the same demographic and funding challenges. We see it in the US, we see it in the UK, and I don't doubt we'll see more of it.
Of course, there have been already many other examples of UK institutions coming together over past years. And it's not always solely universities. I mean, there are examples of higher and further education uniting, notably London South Bank University Group in 2019 brought together the university with further education and secondary education institutions. And now we hear from this Universities UK survey that a very large proportion of institutions may be considering merging or kind of working as a federation as an option. So taking the long view, can you, Chris Havergal, make the case, perhaps the elevator pitch case for mergers?
I mean, I think the case would simply be that universities need that scale to compete. And in many cases, we simply have too many universities. Why, for example, does Plymouth have 3 universities? Why does Leeds have 5? In a sector under intense financial strain, enrolments at many providers shrinking, and the government in the UK either unable or unwilling to provide support, the tap of international student dollars having been turned off, the argument is that consolidation has to be part of the solution. All of these institutions have vice-chancellors and other senior leaders who don't come cheap. They have marketing teams, admission teams, and other departments which could work on a larger scale, and that could deliver you significant efficiencies and deliver additional resilience in a very volatile operating environment. It also allows you to bring together complementary strengths in some of the examples that we've talked about, and especially in an environment where research funding is increasingly competitive, having that critical mass can allow you to win more funding. So, yeah, it's about sort of bringing those strengths together and being more resilient in a very challenged operating environment.
Well, off the back of that, I can't really imagine why anyone's not doing this. So perhaps you could now put the case against.
These is a finely balanced argument, because I suppose the counter argument is that many of our most successful universities are institutions which have really clear missions and often a very clear sense of place. And they're central to the civic identity of a city. They're closely tied to regional skills needs and economic growth. They've got a really strong student community that identifies with the institution, and they're at the heart of local cultural life. With mergers, the risk is that you lose that to blander, more distant institutions which are less rooted in their communities and less responsive to local skills needs, and therefore ultimately less effective. The other counter argument for mergers is that actually they're pretty complex things to achieve. And again, as we've said repeatedly through this podcast, a lot of the sort of savings and integration is actually yet to happen. So a lot of the savings that are hoped for are yet to materialise. So in that sense, they're not the quick fix to the sector funding crisis that we might hope for. And given that complexity, the risk is that they take all of the governance focus of institutions on trying to get a project like this over the line, when actually putting an institution on a sustainable footing while protecting the student experience and the research enterprise is hard enough as it is. So is it the right thing now for a sector in crisis to be focusing on savings which may come many years down the line, when actually the real battle at the moment is just to keep the lights on tomorrow?
Yes, as you say, there's very much, strong arguments for and against. So I'm interested in what the general feeling is across the UK sector. I mean, obviously we've got this Universities UK survey that's come out, but I suspect that's not necessarily representative of the full roster of university staff. That's probably coming from sort of leadership levels, one would assume. Is it generally felt that mergers are a positive thing, or are they seen as more of a last resort?
I mean, I think there's a recognition that they probably have to be part of the solution. I think a lot of leaders would certainly see the important thing as being, protecting what we offer to students and making sure that we've got research and training that contributes to economic growth that applies to the UK and anywhere else. And ultimately, that's what matters, and the structures that you have to deliver that are of secondary importance. I do think for individual staff, there's a lot of questions that they would have about consolidation and what that means for their own roles, but also what it means for their institutions, but also I think what it means for the sector as a whole. And I think that's where actually the primary concern around some of this merger activity would be, that it's happening in a very unplanned way. The mergers that we've seen so far largely involve institutions that are seen as attractive propositions for acquiring university. There are lots of other institutions which are maybe less attractive. They might have more debts, less research intensivity, but they're equally important to their students and the communities that they serve. And if they can't be saved in this way, you really have the risk of sort of cold spots opening out across the sector. So it's happening in an unplanned way. I suppose the other concern is that the government isn't really doing a great deal to support this. And this is, again, another sense that while it might have worked in these cases so far, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a model for the sector. If in the case of really financially challenged institutions, you wanted to see a merger as a solution, you would likely need the government to provide some funding to sort of oil the wheels of that deal.
Yes, so a better planned or joined up and better supported approach here might offset some of the bigger risks associated with universities amalgamating. But that will require government or a trusted sector body to offer some national oversight and strategy, which seems very unlikely to happen. So for now, we are left with essentially a free market setup. As we've recognised in talking through a number of mergers that are either in progress or have happened, every single one is very different. But are there any lessons that you think could perhaps be drawn from past examples on what does tend to work better and what perhaps often proves less effective?
There are armies of management consultants making a living out of this in UK higher education at the moment. I don't know how my expertise compares to them, but I'll give you an answer, which I suppose the mergers which are likely to be successful, in my opinion, are ones that have a clear strategic reasoning for coming together, that both sides fully buy into, and that both sides are able to sell to their staff, students, and alumni. I think there have to be clear goals which are around the institution's core missions of research and education. If you can make that case, I think you can sell it to staff. I think a purely defensive merger is unlikely to be successful, but it's also unlikely to win many supporters. The other thing that's really important is sensitivity to people, because universities are essentially institutions driven by their staff, students, and, as I say, alumni. That all of those groups have very strong bonds to their institutions. And so I think, again, if you're going to make a success of something like this, you have to be really transparent in your communication, and you have to bring people with you on the journey. The final thing, you probably also have to accept that there'll be quite a few bumps on the way and teething troubles. And again, I think you've got to have the strategic goal that you can continue to drive towards and not be thrown off course by those. Because, as I say, with coming together of this complexity, it's just inevitable that it won't all be plain sailing.
Of course. And the Universities UK survey that I've referenced would suggest that these mergers may become a quite common occurrence in future years. Do you think that is the case, or are institutions generally seeking other solutions to their financial challenges at the moment?
Well, mergers aren't a silver bullet, as I've said, and certainly institutions are undertaking pretty much everything they can to try to become sustainable, cutting jobs, sadly, rationalising course offerings, pursuing new income streams as well. But consolidation has to be part of the solution. I'm sure we will see more mergers, but again, I think there's a question over whether we'll see genuine coming togethers of universities of significant size, or whether we're actually talking about acquisitions, whether we're talking about less prosperous institutions being taken over by more prosperous ones. So I don't think it'll just be mergers. I think we'll see a wider range of structures emerge. Some of the federations and alliances that we talk about, and the Kent Greenwich case is an example of that. More sharing of services between institutions, undoubtedly, even if they maintain their own identities, and different types of coming together. We've talked so far about university to university mergers. You quite rightly have raised the example of FE-HE mergers like London South Bank. I expect we could see more of that. The other change I think we could also see is more private sector players coming into the mix. We've seen at Lincoln Bishop University, which is a very small and very challenged institution. We've got private players like Global University Systems essentially propping that university up and potentially having a bigger role to play in that institution in future. Again, you had institutions like the University of Buckingham potentially attracting private funding. So there's a range of structures we're likely to see. Ultimately, the likely result is fewer institutions. But if you're in that environment where it's just a much more diverse range of structures and governance, I think there is a question about what that means for the sense of a UK higher education sector and the alignment of the institutions that are in it with regional identities and with skills needs. It seems inevitable that this is the journey that we're on in the absence of a significant rethink of government funding. The question is, what sort of sector are we left with at the end of it? Probably, in the circumstances, it's the best way to try and protect what we do hold as being important in the sector. But the end point remains to be seen.
As you say, merging can come in many forms. And of course, there are ways to consolidate or share services or build economies of scale that don't necessitate wholesale merging of two institutions. But what we can be absolutely certain of is that change is coming. In fact, it's already happening. And the sector may look very different in a few years' time. Chris, look, thank you so much for coming on News Talks once again and helping us understand what all this activity may mean, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. And we'll hope to have you back soon.
Anytime, Miranda. Thanks very much.
And that's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do like, share and subscribe. And of course, you can find more News Talks podcasts on the Times Higher Education website, timeshighereducation.com/podcasts. And we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.